Thank you to Peter and the other panelists for opening the public part of the conference today. I was interested to hear that Ambassador Black has a similar background to me as a poor Irishman. So from one poor Irishman to another, my name is John Bew, and I'm the Deputy Director of ICSR. And in terms of my role today, I'm the Content Director for the conference. Our new panelists will start to take their seats now. That's a cue, of course. And as they do, let me start by explaining the background to today's session, which is the last of today. For about 120 working group participants and another 40 to 60 observers, the conference started at 9 a.m. today on the 18th floor of the Waldorf Astoria in a number of breakout rooms. And I should say the whole process in terms of organizing the content for the conference really began in earnest about 3 or 4 months ago, when in close collaboration with our partners at the National Defence University, in the NISA Centre, the Near East South Asia Centre, we decided upon 7 working groups, each of which addressed what we regarded as a current and pressing issue, whether that be a regional issue or a current and pressing security issue. Obviously, as a caveat, I should say that our list of working groups was far from exhaustive in their scope. However, I think it's fair to say that we did cover a broad range of very important issues, which also tally with the main research interests of both ICSR and the NISA Centre at NDU. Before I turn to the chairman, I'd like to publicly thank them all for their efforts and hard work, and also thank the participants and observers today. The chairman in particular have all taken time to produce substantial steering documents which were circulated among the participants and which form the platform for today's discussion. And on that basis, we've brought together over 100 experts, academics, policymakers, people with frontline experience as well, both militarily and in the security services, to ensure what we think is a very high-level quality discussion. And the whole sort of idea was to stimulate fresh thinking, find out more intelligent solutions, if you like, to these problems, and have a lively and good-spirited debate. Now, having been with Peter around the corridors today and put my ear to the door, I think in most cases it was a good-spirited, good quality debate, although it was quite hard to distinguish between microphones in the larger sessions and raised voices in some of the smaller sessions. Our 7 rapporteurs for each group are still locked into the 18th floor, working on a series of documents summarizing the findings from each group, which will be produced, I hope, if not by the end of the session, by first thing tomorrow morning, 2-page documents summarizing the course of the day's discussions. But I think in this session what we have is a preview, really, of what those working groups discussed in their 3 sessions, and some recommendations, if not solutions, recommendations, calls for fresh thinking and fresh research. So we have quite a lot to fit in before the end of the session. And I'll start right away with Working Group 1, which focused on an extremely important and pressing and relevant issue, but one which goes across geographical boundaries, and that is the question, something we've heard a lot about recently, of negotiations with terrorist organizations. Should it be done? When might it be done? And does it make any particular situation better or worse when it is done? The chairman of that working group was Ambassador Mitchell Rees, who is president-elect of Washington College and a former director of the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department, also former presidential special envoy to the Northern Irish peace process. Now, Mitchell, because he is president-elect of Washington College, has had to run off to LaGuardia Airport to go to his new house and sort out decorations and all these important things before he starts his job tomorrow. So, thankfully, and standing in his place, we have Dr. Martin Frampton, who is a lecturer in modern British history at Queen Mary University in London and the author of 3 important books on Northern Ireland and the Northern Irish Troubles. One on the strategy of the IRA through the 1980s and 1990s. One called Talking to Terrorists, which I co-wrote with him, so I can recommend very strongly. and a forthcoming book on the real IRA. Now, I know he covered a much more broad range of issues than the IRA in that group, so I will hand over to Martin and ask him to deliver his working group conclusions. No more than 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. As he says, I'm going to endeavour to try and fill in for Mitchell, who can't be here, and I'll try and keep it brief. I think the start point for our discussions today were provided by the recognition in the steering paper for the group that governments have, and indeed do, talk to their enemies. That, as unpalatable as it often is, states have negotiated with terrorists. And from that foundation, we considered a few historical examples, not in any effort to establish some kind of one-size-fits-all paradigm or template, but in order to try and tease out some common features or themes that might hold resonance for the contemporary world. We therefore considered the case studies of Northern Ireland, where the British state faced the terrorist campaign of the Provisional IRA, the Basque Country, where the Spanish government faced the campaign of ETA, and Sri Lanka, where the government there faced the campaign from the LTTE, better known as the Tamil Tigers. Each of these case studies is obviously unique, and you could probably find as many differences between them as there are similarities. But I think taken together and trying, if you like, to stand back, it is possible to find various indices for measuring when and how states talk to terrorists and with what result. So to, if you like, offer some of those themes that I think came out of today, it's important to know what the context is in terms of the conflict. One might look at what goes into making the conflict in terms of a variety of enablers and secondary factors. What are the demographics of the situation that go into making up a terrorist organization? What is the economic situation? Is there high levels of unemployment in an area, as there was in the Basque Country in the late 70s and early 80s, a sort of youth bulge and a pool of unemployed young men? And can the state begin to erode the capacity of its terrorist opponents by removing that source of recruits? What this feeds into is the kind of terrorist threat faced. Crucially, governments must take into account the nature of the enemy that they face. And indeed, what is the trajectory of the conflict? Is it upwards or downwards? Put simply, do terrorist organizations believe they are winning or losing? And what is the likely impact of any decision to engage in dialogue as a result of this? What is the relationship of the state to the threat that it faces? Do they have, to use a phrase from Northern Ireland, full spectral dominance of the terrain? So in the case of what happened in Northern Ireland, the British government enjoyed overwhelming superiority to the terrorist enemy it faced, enjoyed control of the physical terrain and indeed the intelligence terrain. And I think it's immediately obvious that situation doesn't apply to some of the contemporary conflicts where people are advocating that dialogue should be undertaken. And indeed, what is the character of the state itself? And how does this affect the range of solutions open to them? Are they able to deploy more hard-edged solutions to a terrorist threat? And what is the balance between that hard-edged solution and a resort to dialogue? What this leads on to, I think, are broader questions about the character of, about the context, particularly with regards to neighbouring states and the environment in which a terrorist threat is faced. Do states today facing terrorist threats live in what we might call bad neighbourhoods? Clearly, this is an issue that pertains to Israel and the threat it faces from the Islamist movements, Hezbollah and particularly Hamas. What is the role of other actors there, such as Iran? And again, there are obviously differences between the way in which the Spanish and French states work together to eventually confront the threat of ETA, or the British and Irish governments work to confront the threat of the IRA, and clearly some of those synergies don't apply in the case of Israel. And likewise, in relation to the Taliban challenge posed in Afghanistan. Clearly, there are issues pertaining to geographic context, the role of Pakistan, and the capacity of the Taliban to operate across borders, not just into Pakistan, but in terms of transnational networks of informal economies, such as the drug trade, which obviously do much to fuel their capacity to wage insurgency or terrorism.